There's this phrase about history that I don't particularly like. It's that history is written by the victors. Now, I'm not so naive as to think that it's not true. It is. Certainly in the long past, if you were the winner of whatever battle you fought, there probably wasn't anybody left to write about what happened. But I also have always found it sort of, cynical. That we know there are other stories, other things that have happened in the past besides this one singular idea of what happened, and we're just choosing to ignore it. But this idea is a favorite of this current administration. This idea is a favorite of the president in particular. He likes a version of this, to the victor go the spoils, and certainly getting to decide what is and isn't true about history is a huge spoil you get for winning. Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff, loves this idea about rewriting history and taking control of what is and isn't American heritage and history and who gets to belong to that, and more importantly for him, who doesn't. Earlier this week, I wrote about on the Make It Make Sense Substack a new report from the White House attacking the Smithsonian's National American History Museum, which is one of the crown jewels of the entire Smithsonian institution. If you've ever been to D.C. and taken a trip through that museum, you know what I'm talking about. But in this report, the White House said they found it to be not a crown jewel, but instead something to be discarded and torn down and remodeled because they said it was divisive and meant to divide Americans. In fact, they said it was un-American. They said it focused too much on black and brown communities, on the stories of immigrants, the stories of women, and definitely the stories of gay Americans. And this new report is just a part of a broader federal assault on history, as my guest today would put it. My guest today is Marc Stein. He is the president of the Organization of American Historians, the nation's largest and most prestigious group of American historians, the people who chronicle who we are and where we've been so that we can understand where we're going. He's also a professor at San Francisco State University and one of the voices behind Out History, which chronicles and details LGBTQ history in the United States. And he's been trying to work to collect what's being lost from our museums and our national archives right now, specifically when it comes to those communities. But most recently, he wrote a piece for Time magazine about this federal assault on history. And I wanted to ask him what it is that we're losing when we attack things like the Smithsonian and our idea and understanding of our collective American history writ large. What does it mean to erase whole groups of Americans from what is our American tapestry, the history and the stories that we tell about ourselves? And what do we lose in accountability when it comes to understanding where we've been, like I said before, to where we're going? It's a fascinating conversation. Marc is a great guest and really cares deeply about these things. And I think we all should, because this stuff belongs to all of us, regardless of how you feel about each individual part of history. It's Friday, July 10th, 2026. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Hermes. Marc, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I want to talk about this brand new report, fantasy, fan fiction about the Smithsonian, whatever we want to call this thing. I mean, they're calling it Saving America's History out of the administration here. But what do you call this thing? I've read it a couple times now, and I find it pretty astonishing. But what's your feeling about this?
Well, it's a hit piece on the National Museum of American History, and put out on the White House website on July 4th, so on our 250th birthday. And it was authored by the Domestic Policy Council, so we could figure out who exactly is represented there. But it's just the latest White House attack on American history as a field, on museum professionals, on the Smithsonian specifically. And I'm sure we can get into the specifics of the character of that attack.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The headline of this thing was that they said that the Smithsonian, specifically the American History Museum, Smithsonian, right, the National Museum of American History, was now designed to divide Americans and was a kind of bastardization of American history. It feels as if this is just instead a political agenda attack from the administration then.
Absolutely. There's an ideological agenda to change the way we approach American history, to take American history out of the hands of people who study it for years and then teach it in American high schools and colleges and universities and in the nation's museums, and instead put forward a very old-fashioned, retro narrative of American history in which we only focus on great American presidents, military victories, conquest of a continent, in which we erase the experiences of workers, of immigrants, of women, of people of color, of LGBTQ people, of people with disabilities, and it, really responds to the democratization of history that we've seen in educational contexts in museums over the last several decades.
I know I do want to talk about that in a minute here, but you noted in hopefully as this episode comes out, it's out now in Time magazine, but in as we were talking, a forthcoming column about a footnote in this Saving America's History, report from the White House that was 1,200 words long about land acknowledgements at museums around the country. Is that what this kind of thing is, and that the White House is rejecting this idea?
Yeah, it's a kind of gotcha report. And
Hmm.
so since it seems to really annoy the current administration that a whole variety of organizations and institutions have found it important to acknowledge the Native American lands on which they are meeting, they are presenting, they are educating, they are informing, and it labels that anti-white and anti-American, regardless of how those land acknowledgements are worded or framed. And to prove that, it goes on, yes, in more than 1,200 words, to just offer example after example of Smithsonian leaders offering land acknowledgements. And one of the things that's most objectionable about the report is it's so selective and biased in what it chooses to present about the Smithsonian. I visited the museum in March. My partner and I went as part of a week-long trip to Washington, D.C., and I saw a mix of old school and innovative exhibits. I saw a large exhibit on American wars, the exhibit that I think has been there for decades on first ladies and their gowns,
Yeah, yeah.
on democracy. We got a sneak preview of the exhibit that was being organized for US 250,
Hmm.
and then exhibits that I would characterize as more in line with the way the study of history has moved over the last few decades. So there was a great exhibit on on Latino lowrider car
Yeah.
culture. There was a exhibit on Filipino immigrants. Probably my favorite and where I took the most photographs was the exhibit on entertainment. And so you
Mm.
got to see All in the Family living room setting, and you got to see, all sorts of classic American television sets from the last several decades. Not political, not deeply political, not deeply partisan, not deeply ideological. And I just think of all the youth that go through the museum. And if military history is your thing, you have that section of the museum. If popular culture is your thing, you have plenty of exhibits for that. And the administration seems to want a singular, triumphant mythology rather than real history.
You also said, too, that there is something both bizarrely obsessed and delusionally paranoid about what's in this about the Smithsonian. Can you walk me through those ideas?
Yeah, well, there's just a few things that seem to have stuck in their craw, and so the land acknowledgements footnote is one example of that. There's references to multiple references to exhibits on immigrants, and as we've seen in political discourse over the last decade. There's on the one hand a claim that the focus is on that the concern is about violent illegals, quote unquote. But in fact, the critique is of any coverage of immigrants as a positive aspect of American history. And, there's also a weird several pages on trans history and
Mhm.
gender history and women's history that instead of, for example, again, showcasing the first wives, the first ladies' gowns, just finds a few random examples, as part of its assault on trans people, on the humanity of trans people, on gender history, and then it blames all of this on a weird stew of Marxism, intersectionality, and social justice, without ever defining those terms, conflating them as all the same, which would
Mhm.
surprise many academic theorists, and it's maybe of a piece with the recent attacks on communism in American life, which really
Sure.
seems like a page out of either the 50s or the 70s.
Yeah, it really does feel that way. Like we've taken a step backwards in time, which, like, as a history professor, must feel a little odd that we're taking these kinds of steps backwards right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
Yeah,
and I'll just say, my position at San Francisco State, I was hired to teach constitutional law. I teach other subjects. I teach the history of sexuality. I teach social movements, but the most regular course that I teach is on constitutional law, a very traditional subject.
yeah.
I teach the Declaration. I teach the Constitution. And yes, I do much more probably than professors in the past to focus on decisions about slavery and immigration and women and gay people and people with disabilities. But my students also get the big, broad narrative of American history told through the history of the US Constitution. Those are not mutually exclusive. We can teach the big, grand narrative and be more democratic and inclusive about it. And I think that's really what I saw at the Smithsonian when I visited.
The thing about this Smithsonian report that also got me is that it's not just this political tool to be used as a cudgel against the Smithsonian and museums writ large, but it's also really poorly written and, like, just riddled with factual errors and, like, mischaracterizations that somebody who I think might be a little bit better equipped to handle these things, even if what they wanted to do was in line with what the White House wanted to do, they just wouldn't have made these mistakes. So it almost undercut some of this stuff, but at the same time feels like, to me, it made what they were trying to do worse because so many things were just outright wrong.
Absolutely. And, and I think that if I encountered some of this kind of writing in a student paper, I would call it out. I mean, one of the
Yeah.
things I think it has such padding in the form of footnotes. So, so multiple examples where the same source is cited in the same paragraph, and instead of one footnote, which would certainly suffice, there's 10, and again, land acknowledgements, no one is going to deny that Smithsonian leaders offer on occasion land acknowledgments, and instead
Right.
we get 30 examples. And if I may, I'd like to share um, uh, some of the words of Smithsonian leaders in some of the current exhibits, which are just completely at odds with the
Yeah.
claim that the museum denigrates American history and refuses to celebrate American history. So the report acknowledges that the exhibit to celebrate US 250, which was called In Pursuit of Life, Liberty, and Happiness. Quote, highlights 250 objects from the museum's collections, including remarkable artifacts like the desk Thomas Jefferson used to draft the Declaration, George Washington's uniform, a ship of the early U.S. Navy, and of course the Star-Spangled Banner, the 1813 flag. And so that's a very traditional
Yeah.
a set of objects that the Smithsonian could share. And the director, in introducing the exhibit, these were her words. You tell me if this sounds like denigration and a refusal to celebrate. She wrote, "Thank you for joining us this year as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Throughout the museum, you'll experience the history and legacies of the revolutionary generation that took a great leap into democracy together in 1776. And you'll see how Americans have worked since that time to realize the ideals written into this groundbreaking document. We are proud to celebrate the birth of the United States." Right? That's just completely at odds with the characterization we get in this
Yeah.
report. It's a hit job.
Yeah. That sounds like a pretty banal museum director statement to me. Like, and it's like you said, completely at odds with what's in this report. But
Absolutely. Absolutely.
and as you've been saying too, like this is a part of a, what you've described before, another writing as a federal assault on history in a report from just, early last month, right? The Harp report.
Right, that's right.
Uh,
So,
but
the project that I've been connected to, which is connected to the Organization of American Historians, called
Mhm.
the History, Archives, and Records Preservation Project, and we
Yeah.
released a report in June called the Federal Assault on History,
Mhm.
that documents the 18-month campaign against the National Archives, against the history profession, against historians working for federal agencies, many of whom were fired in the Doge
Mhm.
process, the reductions in funding for responding to Freedom of Information Act requests, and agency by agency, we attempt to show just what's happening and to present it as a coordinated campaign that's really damaging the history infrastructure of the federal government, and we believe that that also damages democracy.
Yeah, in that report, you write about it as a three-pronged approach, and I kind of want to pick these apart a little bit. But it's censorship and erasure, it's attacks on the institutions themselves, which I think is both museums and educators, right? And then also
Yes.
this compelling of quote unquote patriotic history. But let's start with the censorship. We've seen that at national parks and national monuments around the country, and some of those have been put back in place by courts. Some of them haven't. We've seen that throughout Smithsonian institutions and their museums right now. We can see it in this new Smithsonian report. But what are the other instances of censorship and erasure that you're talking about?
Yeah, well, the one that's really been in the news the most is the President's House
Yeah.
exhibits on slavery in Philadelphia at Independence National Historical Park. So a lot of this has focused on the National Park Service, and the courts have ruled back and forth, but currently they are removed,
Mhm.
and so that's an example. There's also the purging of government websites of all
Yeah.
references to LGBT history. And
Yeah.
the website I direct, Out History, has proudly rehoused a few government reports on LGBTQ history that were taken down from government websites. There's the hilarious story of material about the Enola Gay,
Yeah.
the atomic bomb, being removed because their AI generated searches had picked up on the word gay.
Right.
And so before anybody, before any human being checked the work, they removed material about the Enola Gay.
Right.
So that's the censorship has targeted in particular histories of immigrants, Native Americans, African Americans, LGBTQ Americans. So that's the first prong. Then there's the attack on infrastructure,
Mhm.
and that includes long-term declines in funding for the National Archives, but we're recently focusing on threatened closures of National Archives branches in in San Francisco Bay Area, specifically in San Bruno and in Chicago. There was an earlier threat to close in Seattle, and then as we were saying before, just removal, firing of historians in a lot of different federal government agencies. The Organization of American Historians has actually launched a huge oral history project that's attempting to capture the perspectives of people who were fired from government jobs in the last 18 months. And I think it's going to be an incredible resource for historians of the future who are going to look back on our moment and want to know, what exactly did it mean that agency after agency after agency lost their archive, lost their professional historian, lost their librarians, right? And so that's the second prong. And yes, and then the third is this promotion of a singular, elite-driven, quote unquote patriotic narrative, but in fact, it's only one kind of patriotic narrative. There are, of course, multiple kinds of patriotic narratives, and trying to make government funding for colleges and universities, coercively requiring that educational institutions toe the federal government line. That's completely at odds with our tradition of local control over education. And it's trying to control the history that's presented in national parks, in the Smithsonian, and in other places. And then we see, well, the report that we're talking about focuses on the federal assault. There are state level echoes, and we've seen that especially in Florida and Texas. Just this week, there was a favorable court decision striking down Governor DeSantis's attempt to control how history is taught in Florida, colleges and universities and other educational institutions. Texas has essentially banned the teaching of gender in colleges and universities. And, we'll see how that plays out in the courts. So while much of this is being coordinated by the federal government, there are echoes definitely at state and local levels.
You know how every social media platform is basically engineered to make you angry and keep you scrolling? That's not an accident. Outrage performs better than nuance, so the algorithm feeds you outrage. I see it every day as someone making news content for a living. The loudest, most biased takes get the reach. The careful, fact-driven stuff like I do my best to bring you here gets buried. That's why I joined Say So. It's a brand new news app just launched, built by a group of former journalists and engineers who asked, what if we build news from scratch for people who actually want to be informed instead of people who just want to keep scrolling? No algorithm optimizing for outrage, no AI slop, just vetted creators delivering fact-driven coverage, curated so you can know what's going on in 5 minutes and then get on with your day. If you're the kind of person who is intentional about your sleep, your workouts, your work, what you eat, but your news diet is just whatever your feed throws at you, this is for you. The same energy finally applied to how you stay informed. I'm one of the first creators on Say So, and my favorite feature is that I can link my sources right in the video. That way, you know how I'm telling you the truth. And if you sign up now, you'll be one of the first users to join. You can download Say So. The link is in the show notes and the description. Go check it out and be as smart as you know you are. All right, let's get back to the show. In a much larger sense, and I think this is the better conversation that we really should be having about some of this stuff too, but to get to this, we had to talk about the stuff that we just spent the last 20 minutes talking about. It's that the erasure of the histories of these sections of Americans and what patriotism looks like for those groups of Americans, whether it's immigrants, whether it's Black and brown Americans, whether it is, the traditional white American approach to this, whether it's Native Americans, whether it's, the history of gay rights and gay Americans,
right,
and what that looks like, erasing those histories. What does that mean for those communities and their existence in the United States and our collective understanding of them here?
Yeah, it's just devastating, and I think that when I think about the thousands of students I've now taught over several decades, yes, I have many students who just love traditional American history, love studying the presidents and the wars and the Constitution, and but I also have many students who aren't initially turned on by that. But if they see that history can also be the history of their immigrant community or of their form of work,
Hmm.
or of women, say, if they're a woman or if they're someone who cares about women.
Right.
And I certainly see this in my LGBTQ students who maybe experienced primary, secondary education in which they never saw themselves represented, and then
Hmm.
they realize this can be history. And what is so counterproductive about this approach is that I've seen time and time again students who then get inspired through these forms of history then realize that they really should study the Declaration of Independence. They really should study the U.S. Constitution. That there are important intersections between those social histories of racial communities, ethnic communities, immigrant communities, gender, sexual communities, and the grand political, legal histories that were long at the center of the way we taught history.
Right. There's also this connection between, what you've called historical inquiry and democratic accountability, and I don't think that people connect those two very often. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, we need to have archives, and we need to have government records in part to be able to hold government accountable, right? And so, we've seen controversies about recent, say, presidential records or government records, but historians and many, many other types of researchers use these records to
Hmm.
help us understand the long history of the nation. Businesses need those kind of records to research, say, title and property records. Lawyers need them, right? And
Hmm.
so, really, the entire society needs a modern society needs these kinds of government record systems. But with respect to democracy, it's the basic issue of accountability. How
Hmm.
can we make sure that we have public access to government records rather than keeping government records secret, only available to a limited number of people, only available to political and economic elites, and that's why it's going to be so important over the next decade or two to try to recover from the devastating losses that we've experienced in the last few years.
Do we have an idea of how much we're losing of our historical record, our historical identity right now? I know it's hard to put a number on or our fingers on, but
Yeah,
do we have an idea?
well, the thing is, it's not really quantifiable, I guess I would
Right.
say. I mean, real in the weeds archivists could tell you they could quantify for us what's at risk, and there's great concern actually within the archives world about how government cutbacks are
Hmm.
limiting our ability at precisely the moment when we need to be designing new ways to capture digital histories and our online records, right?
Yeah.
Requiring real revolutions in the way that archives do their work. So they could probably provide some kind of quantification. And I also would say that there's a lot of efforts now in civil society to find alternative places for many different kinds of government records. So again, the website I run, Out History, when it was brought to our attention that some government reports dealing with LGBTQ history were being taken down. They're government reports, so they're in the public domain. There are no issues of copyright or permissions. And so we republished them. And we're not the only ones. And so there was a huge National Park Service report on LGBTQ space and geography and landmarks. And that is now available on Out History. There was a report about queering the women's suffrage movement that also was taken down. You know, the report looked at a variety of different types of people who participated in the women's suffrage struggle who could today be described as queer. That was taken down. We republished it, and those are just two examples. But so I wouldn't say that that all of it is going to be lost, but it is really a striking statement to say that these are not going to be government recognized. There's a legitimacy that comes right from having these materials in government government institutions, and I think moving forward, many communities are going to be having complicated discussions. Do we want to trust our valuable community resources to government libraries and archives and institutions? And I hope the answer to that will be yes, but it's going to require a rebuilding of trust, you know, so that people are going to be willing to let governments be the repositories for valuable community-based materials.
There's an interesting thing here, too, that we are in this moment that this kind of thing has happened before in the United States, right? Even around our bicentennial, this also sort of happened. This forcibly looking backwards to a time that didn't really exist, this idea that we needed to oppose all these other movements within the United States. And that's what your new book is about. How's that for a segue? But I think that it fits this moment that we're in. Talk to me about the similarities of what we're talking about and this moment that we're living in right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, thanks for the plug. The book's called Bicentennial, A Revolutionary History of the 1970s. You know, I think what you said is absolutely true. There was the official bicentennial celebration that had some of the same boastful qualities of US 250, some of the same very traditional narratives about American greatness and American exceptionalism. But I'm also struck by some of the differences in the two moments. So Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, as part of their language about the bicentennial, celebrated the United States as a nation of immigrants. Richard Nixon called for open borders. Gerald Ford, the day after July 4th, presided over a naturalization ceremony at Monticello, right? And can we imagine the current administration doing US 250 in a way that recognizes and celebrates immigrants? There also were community-based efforts. Here I'll single out the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation, which was a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. They were concerned about how few recognized national historical landmarks were focused on African American history. And they did the work to recommend several dozen sites, and the number just exploded in the late 70s, the number of sites. And I think we now take that for granted 50 years later, where we expect that some percentage of our recognized National Historic Landmarks will be focused on people of color and immigrants and women and LGBTQ people, but that's a relatively new thing. And at the time of the bicentennial, there was this push, and governments were much more willing to accept those claims because they recognized the legitimacy of those claims, and they recognized the value of diversifying and democratizing the sites that we recognize in our landscape.
How do we dig ourselves out of this hole? How do we pull our present out of our past in the way that this administration wants to keep us in the past?
Well, I think in the next couple of years, we just need to keep doing what we're doing, finding alternative homes for valuable historical materials, doing whatever we can to critique statements like the new report that just came out. The Organization of American Historians is taking the lead in a multi-pronged effort that's called We Want More History. It's focused on late September, and it's an effort to get hundreds or thousands of civic groups, local libraries, history departments, to just organize something, a talk, a lecture, a conversation, a discussion, a walk, a hike, that will, we hope, demonstrate to the broadest American public that people are interested in history, people love history, people want history, that people are not happy with the level of control and the level of cutbacks. And we're trying to send a message to the general public, but obviously also to legislators that we have to fight back not only against the new attacks, but there are also long-standing, decades-long cuts that we need to begin to redress, and I think that's just going to be one moment of many, where the broad history community, that includes archivists, librarians, museum professionals, educators, and then community-based and academic and public historians, that all can come together and the broader world of the humanities, people who are interested in arts and literature and culture, to show that these are absolutely vital parts of American culture, and they need and deserve public support.
Do you think that a lot of Americans know this kind of thing is happening to the degree that it's happening? I think when you talk to Americans, most of them like their American History Museum. They like the Smithsonian's. These are popular institutions nationally, at the federal level, and at their state and local levels. Do you think that when this idea starts getting out there, that they'll be on board with what the administration's doing?
Well, I've definitely been getting lots of emails and texts from people who have heard my recent comments about the attack on the Smithsonian, to talk about how they love the Smithsonian. They can't believe the Smithsonian of all institutions is under attack right now. I've been thinking actually over the last couple of days also about how the report, I don't think at a single moment does it do anything like a user survey, an audience survey. And it kind of demonstrates a whole approach to museum pedagogy, museum teaching, that's at odds with, I think, how the Smithsonian itself works. The Smithsonian is routinely concerned with feedback from the people who come through the museums. And I don't think there's a moment in that report where we actually get evidence that those who go to the Smithsonian experience the Smithsonian in the way the report claims, right? And I think they don't, because either they're not professionally trained, in how to gauge audience responses in museums. They don't care. They know that the response actually has been generally very positive, right? And likely they had access to the Smithsonian's own studies of audiences and users, and they weren't going to touch the responses because the audience experience is generally favorable.
Yeah, I think it's probably all of the above on that one there. Marc, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
I want to thank Marc again for coming on the show. You can find a link to the Organization of American Historians, his new book, Bicentennial, that Harp Report, and Out History, all in the show notes for this episode. And that is it for today's episode. Please rate or review the show wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where paid subscribers get a second article this week all about the Department of Justice and the administration bragging about intimidating states to hand over their voter rolls ahead of the midterms while claiming its election integrity and at the same time dismantling those very same things that we use to make sure that our elections are secure. But that is just for paid subscribers. You can get access to that for less than $1 an episode a month. Plus, you get access to the Things You Forgot from Civics Class newsletter and Make It Make Nonsense, and you help support all the great free content that you love every week. And as always, share the show on social media. I am at Grant Hermes on Twitter and Blue Sky and the Say So News app, and at Grant_Hermes on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Hermes, and I'll talk to you next time.